I'd like to just introduce myself. My name is Renée Ater, and I'm an assistant professor at the University of Maryland, and I will be the moderator for the Artistic Havens Abroad panel this morning. The three papers that comprise this panel examine the various ways in which American artists have found artistic havens abroad, from which to articulate a set of viewing practices related to 20th century sculpture, 19th century sculpture, to explore a particular style and place, and to formulate racial identity in art as it related to African aesthetics. In numerous publications, scholars have considered the multitude of American artists who have traveled abroad, writing on a range of subjects from the impact of the Paris salons on American art to the formulation of national identity through depictions of Palestine, to the importance of transatlantic travel in the shaping of early American modernism. The three papers today ask us to consider how we might define artistic havens. Are they sites of familiarity and safety? Are they spaces of a particular type of gaze and vantage point? And are they locations of imagination? Cynthia has asked me to speak specifically about African American artists under the rubric of artistic havens abroad. I like Barbara Groseclose's definition of a haven as both an actual and a metaphorical sanctuary, and its specific application to U.S. Black artists traveling abroad. In the brief time that I have, I would like to make 3 points related to the very complex issues of race and artistic havens. And there can be a range and variety of points, but I picked these 3 out for today. First, the entrenched racism and systems of oppression in the United States had much to do with African Americans' travels to Europe. So their very lived experiences in the United States forced them to seek some other place. Second, others constructed Africa, and some actually traveled to places such as Nigeria and Ghana in the aftermath of independence, looking for connections to a symbolic motherland. And third, some believe themselves part of a diasporic community based in the trauma of slavery, not a real place with national boundaries, but an imagined location of perceived shared identity and culture. So I'm not talking here about what might be the contemporary diaspora through exile, immigration, and migration, but really this notion of slavery as being something that holds people together in experiences, and perhaps as serving as a place, as a haven. During the 19th and 20th century, African American artists traveled to Italy and France, seeking training to learn their craft. Just as importantly, they sought freedom from the constrictions of the American slave system, and later from the segregated restrictions of life in the United States. Artists such as Robert Duncanson and Edmonia Lewis made the pilgrimage to Europe with the support of abolitionist patrons, in search of the same sort of artistic training and exposure as other American artists. They also wanted to situate themselves and engage with the American traditions of landscape painting and neoclassical sculpture, respectively. For the well-known expatriate Henry Oswald Tanner, France offered a sanctuary, a place of refuge, where he decided emphatically to paint religious content and not racial material. He successfully, and to critical acclaim, exhibited at the Paris Salon, easily traveled to Palestine and North Africa for subject matter for his religious paintings, and lived with his white American wife without the scrutiny that might have existed back home. In her important study, New Negro Artists in Paris, Teresa Leininger Miller examines a group of 12 African American artists who went to Paris between 1922 and 1934. She notes that this diverse group, including Elizabeth Prophet and Hale Woodruff, traveled to Paris to study, exhibit, mingle, and above all else, to find the freedom to be creative. This, of course, does not mean that African Americans were not without ambivalent feelings for the city or their experiences. Some found it hard to assimilate to the new milieu. Others lived quite solitary existences, and Elizabeth Prophet is a really good example of an artist who was quite isolated in her experience of Paris, while others still felt deep displacement. What is unique about this group is that finding an artistic haven in Paris also meant finding and articulating their own Blackness in their art. In the post-war era, Paris continued to provide a safe haven for painters such as Beaufort Delaney, who made the transatlantic voyage permanently, searching for and finding a supportive community among jazz musicians, writers, and intellectuals, accepting of his homosexual identity and his artistic vision. In the late 1960s and 70s, numerous US Black artists traveled to the Caribbean and Africa, becoming deeply immersed in these cultures and looking for alternative models to European art, and seeing Africa and its material culture in particular as sources to mine. Africa really, for this group of artists, and they range from everyone from Lois Mailou Jones to Betty Saar, to some of the artists that Kirstin Ellsworth will talk about in AfriCOBRA, people like Jeff Donaldson, really saw Africa again as this symbolic homeland and traveled in a sense to these places both as tourists, but also seeking something else beyond tourism in that encounter. Lastly, some African American artists have imagined themselves as part of an African diasporic community, transcending, as Paul Gilroy has written, quote, both the structures of the nation state and the constraints of ethnicity and national particularity, end quote. So that for these artists, it is this imagined space of the African diaspora that has offered an idea of an artistic haven. So those are just my very brief remarks. When Cindy told me I had 4 minutes, I thought, oh my goodness, I'm not sure I can do this in 4 minutes. So I want to introduce our speakers. There's 3 today, and they're very diverse, as I said in the opening, and talking about very diverse subject matter. But our first speaker will be Barbara Groseclose of Ohio State University, who is co-editing an anthology titled Internationalizing American Art History. The second speaker will be Katie Bourguignon, Associate Curator at the Musée d'Art Américain Giverny, where she is currently organizing the exhibition Impressionist Giverny, a colony of artists 1885 to 1915. And the third speaker will be Kirstin Ellsworth of Pitzer College. I have that wrong. Sorry, at Pasadena State College, I wonder where I got that, who's working on a book about images on automotive culture in American art in the 1960s. So we ask that you hold your questions until after all the panelists have spoken, and that at the end of the panel, we're a little tight, so Amelia has a few announcements after our panel, so if you can hold tight and listen to those as well. So Barbara, if you'd like to come up. Thank you.
No one lives long in Rome without loving it, and I must, in the beginning, confess myself to be in the same category. I wish I had written that. William Whitmore's story did, but it describes my own sentiments about Rome, where some years ago I was a resident at the American Academy. When I first arrived, I was reading the journals of Nathaniel Hawthorne, and in his frame of mind, finding Rome simultaneously intensely unlikable and irresistibly compelling. As time passed, I understood why Hawthorne eventually confessed, Rome draws itself to my heart. I learned to love the city, not merely for the material remnants of its classical and Renaissance past, which is easy enough to do, but for the vanished contemporaries of Hawthorne's and Story's own 19th century, the revolutionaries atop the Janiculum building their doomed barricades, the expatriates at the Café Greco drinking coffee and talking of home, the American artists in the galleries seeking training, inspiration, and validation. In the fiction, correspondence, and journals of Hawthorne and Story, and as I was to discover, Henry James as well, Rome is figured not only as a generative site for American artists, but also as a sanctuary, an artistic haven, where access to models, both actual and artistic, was greater and more enriching than circumstances in the States offered. Art historians have productively explored this Roman haven for artists, especially women. In my paper today, I want to look at the American writer's Roman experience as it might be related to art history. In particular, how the novels Hawthorne and James wrote about American artist life in Rome turn on male sculptors whose nude male statuary license the author's viewing of the male body and frame some of the issues that circumstance evokes. Story comes into my narrative because both Hawthorne and James allude to him as a touchstone for their respective fictional sculptors. He also, I believe, serves as an instructive case in regard to the Rome haven. Rome-besotted readers like me love to imagine this city through the eyes of Hawthorne and James, who now as then earned their status as art specialists by acting as ciceroni or guides to readers of their novels. James himself used Hawthorne's Marble Faun, published in 1859, calling it, quote, part of the intellectual equipage of the Anglo-Saxon visitor to Rome, read by every English-speaking traveler who arrives there, who has been there, or who expects to go, unquote. James' own role, guiding Americans abroad through Rome, especially Rome, and converting, as he said, their state of innocence, can be found not only in the sites which play such an important role in Roderick Hudson, published in 1875, and which he always called his first novel, but also in later novels as disparate as Daisy Miller, 1878, and Portrait of a Lady, 1881. I call the authors ciceroni rather than guides because in passages about art in the Marble Faun and Roderick Hudson, they do not merely direct the reader's attention to it, but they offer vivid descriptions as well, which is perhaps why the Italian term has entered the English language. And it's this perspective that we care about. When he first arrived in Rome in 1858, Hawthorne disliked being surrounded by so much art, and he often responded defensively, for example, complaining when required by his wife to visit a gallery of, quote, that peculiar lassitude and despondency coming upon me, which has so often afflicted me while viewing works of art, unquote. He rallied, naturally, and experienced some viewing epiphanies, in particular with the Praxitelean faun. Looking at the statue in the Capitoline Museum, Hawthorne wrote in his journal, his only garment falls halfway down his back, but leaves his whole front and all the rest of his person exposed, displaying a very beautiful form, but clad in more flesh, with more full and rounded outlines than the old sculptors were wont to assign to masculine beauty. The face has a character corresponding with that of the form, beautiful and most agreeable features, but rounded, a nose almost straight, a voluptuous mouth. The whole person conveys the idea of an amiable and sensual nature. In the Marble Faun itself, Hawthorne used the same viewing structure, nearly the same words he used to describe his own visit to the Capitoline, to account for the faun when it is observed by his fictional Americans, torso to face, to parts of face, to interpretation, tempering, however, the journal's delicately carnal assessment. In the novel, the youth's nude body is graceful rather than beautiful. The face is simply agreeable in outline and only somewhat voluptuously developed, while the mouth is merely mischievously about to smile. And sensual creature, adjectives Hawthorne used previously, but which in the novel are intended to consign sensuality to the animal character of the faun. Perhaps Hawthorne dampened his language because the sculptured faun and the human Donatello, the novel's Italian protagonist, are meant to mirror each other physically and emotionally. Donatello, says the narrator, might have figured perfectly as the marble faun, miraculously softened into flesh and blood. Yet blurring the differences between art and life, the human form in stone and as flesh, would have presented Hawthorne with the danger that his remarks about the sensual power of a statue could be applied to an actual man. Instead, Hawthorne relies on Donatello's opposite, an American sculptor named Kenyon, for clarification. Hawthorne explicitly relates the fictional Kenyon to the real-life story and prominently places a model of story statue of Cleopatra, 1858, in Kenyon's studio. Hawthorne also, as he says in the preface, laid felonious hands on Benjamin Paul Acre's statue of a drowned pearl diver, 1858, to be displayed among Kenyon's works, which allowed the author then to spark a debate between the sculptor and Miriam, a painter, on nudity and the hazardous line between the human body and the sculpted form. Miriam decides the point. In antiquity, she asserts, nudity was commonplace, but, quote, nowadays, people are as good as born in their clothes, and there is practically not a nude human being in existence, unquote. Responding to declarations like that, Henry James chided Hawthorne for, quote, remaining unreconciled to the nudity of marbles. He was not without taste, but his taste was not robust, unquote. Further, James observed in a disparagement that endured, Hawthorne's jealousy of undressed images strikes the reader as a strange, vague, long-dormant heritage of his straight-laced Puritan ancestry. James published these remarks about Hawthorne late in his own life, a time when he had developed, at least in his letters, undisguised appreciation for what he called the splendid sense of the male body and its members, unquote, in sculpture, even going so far as to wonder whether there might be an American audience for, quote, divinely naked and intimately associated gentlemen and ladies, flaunting their bellies and bottoms and their other private affairs, unquote. Brave words, quite reversing the engagement with nude male sculpture in the author's earlier Roderick Hudson. James, in that novel, does do a little satirical number on Roderick's mother back in Northampton, who evinced, he wrote, quote, a holy horror of a profession which consists exclusively of making figures of people divested of all clothing, unquote. But his sculptor protagonist, Roderick, creates only boyish figures. Roderick's neophyte American work, which inspired a patron to send him to Rome, is a statuette of, quote, a naked youth drinking from a gourd, squarely planted on his feet, with his legs a little apart, his back slightly hollowed, his head thrown back, and both hands raised to support the rustic cup. The figure might have been some beautiful youth of ancient fable. In Rome, Roderick's first sculpture is drawn from the side of a semi-nude gondolier he had previously observed in Venice, and he wrestles all day with a mountain of clay in his studio, eventually forming a nude youth he calls Adam. A respected art critic in his later years, James, in this early work, concentrates on fictional art. Although he does not name the sculptor's story as Roderick's prototype, which would allow him to refer to actual pieces, as Hawthorne did with Kenyon, James pointedly made his character a New England law student who goes to Rome to become a sculptor, as Story famously did. James was a frequent visitor at Story's studio. Though he privately denigrated Story's art, quote, as memorial bedizenment of billionaires, unquote. And he dismissed as trivial Story's few attempts sculpturing the nude figure, here represented by Story's Bacchus of 1863. In 1903, James wrote a 2-volume biography, William Wetmore Story and His Friends, which is more about the friends than anything else, and an excruciating, to my mind, revelation of James' low opinion of his ostensible subject. To be sure, Story is not known for his nudes, but in choosing sculpture as the focus of their fictional rendering of American artist life abroad, Hawthorne and James both have recourse not only to nudes, but specifically to boyish bodies passively displayed, rather than to examples of more mature male anatomy. In individually recognizing a dynamic in the relationship between the author's actual or imaginative viewing, the sculptured object, and the physical male body on which the sculpture was based, they may have felt some desire to dislocate the experience. More than one critic has observed that the writer's emphasis on the boy element, what literary scholar Leland Person calls sculpture of ephebic manhood, lies at the heart of their respective ruminations on sculpture. Further, these critics tend to imply that, quote, when deciding to write a narrative on sculptors who represent and display the bodies of naked men to other men, unquote, as Person summarizes the issue in The Marble Faun, Hawthorne and James act from a latent homosexual impulse connected to the comely, seductive, and yet unthreatening ephebe, a reading which places, I think, too much emphasis on projecting the psychosexual makeup of the two writers, and thereby skimps both the historical and the Roman context. Tom Lacker, Abigail Solomon Godot, and others have shown that gender and sexual roles were far less codified at mid-century, when Hawthorne and James wrote their novels of American artist life in Italy, than when James wrote his bioanalyses of historian Hawthorne or his praise of bellies and bottoms at the end of the century. And following the lead of Solomon Godot's book, Male Trouble, one might then want to recognize that artistic practices were shaped by the same fluid gender conditions and influenced male-themed ideal sculpture produced by American men in Rome, thus limiting what Hawthorne, James, and Story might have seen at the time. The prevailing mid-century style imagined the soft, unsexual youth just about everywhere, as in Thomas Crawford's Heba and Ganymede, 1842, or Hiram Powers' Fisher Boy, 1848, whereas maturely developed virile male nudes were more rare. Some of the work of the exemplars American sculptors encountered in Italy, from Giovanni Dupre to John Gibson and Antonio Canova, might account for this proclivity, as did, for the Roman community as a whole, the still powerful sway of Winckelmann's idealization of the softer forms of classical male statuary in his writings. Reciprocity between aesthetics and art in mid-19th century Rome, with the image of the youthful male body in the novels of Hawthorne and James, not only underscores the pervasiveness of the gendering discourse taking place, but also addresses how the city served their needs. Rome, Hawthorne declared, is a place where art, quote, fills the mind and cannot easily be kept from flowing out upon the page, unquote, a circumstance which eased his conscience about viewing the Praxiteles faun more than once. Rome provided sanctuary for whatever might be erotic in that fantasy too, for Hawthorne called Italy, quote, a poetic or fairy precinct, where actualities would not be so terribly insisted upon as they are in America, unquote. And what actualities he means. In the studio dialogue with the American sculptor Kenyon, to which I referred previously, Merriam asserts, an artist cannot sculpture nudity with a pure heart, if only because he is compelled to steal guilty glimpses at hired models. The marble inevitably loses its chastity under such circumstances, unquote. In contrast, James appeared initially to have experienced Rome as too much of a reality. Of his first visit, he wrote to his brother William, I went reeling and moaning through the streets in a fever of enjoyment. At last, for the first time, I live. The paradoxes exposed in that outburst foreshadow the consequences of his fictional sculptor Roderick Hudson's attempt to become an expatriate artist. Rome supplies Roderick's greatest inspiration, yet trying to remain abroad, Roderick's killed. If the city provided no haven for the fictional character, it did appear to be a place safe enough for the real-life James to profess, at the turn of the century, his emotional and maybe physical passions too. Deeply attracted to a Norwegian-American sculptor, Hendrik Andersen, James wrote hymn letters that looked back fondly on, quote, those romantic Roman days of ours, which he said he had been forced to surrender because the vulgar world that's not Italy has seized me again. What all this has to do with Story, whose life and art, though certainly not his nude male sculptures, seems to have been a reference point for both Hawthorne and James. In an irony that neither writer could have predicted, Story lived out their fiction. Rome proved too much for the fictional American sculptors, and in a different way for Story as well. When James visited Story in his Palazzo Barberini studio apartment in 1894, this was a photograph of Story taken about in the Palazzo Barberini, taken about 30 years earlier, well past the artist's prime in 1894. James described the artist in a letter as a ghost, very silent and vague and gentle. It was very sad, and the Barberini very empty and shabby. In print, James was more harsh, though, as always, oblique. Quote, "In the long run, Story paid for having sought his development even among the circumstances that at the time of his choice appeared not alone the only propitious, but the only possible," unquote. That is, according to James, Story's choice of Rome in which to develop his art, at mid-century, both a place for Americans to see great art and which had the potential then to allow them to make great art, that ruined him. The increasingly pedestrian quality of Story's figures demonstrates the truth of James' judgment as far as Story's sculpture goes. This is a late piece, Alcestis Chestes, from 1874. For you, I don't have time to read more of in this paper, in its desire to romanticize with the muffled sexuality of his insistently draped figures. And he wondered what would have happened if Story had undressed his figures. Story loved the nude, James declared, as the artist in any field essentially and logically must. But, James goes on to argue, Story's imagination, of necessity, went in preference to the figure for which accessories were of the essence, which is doubtless a proof that he was not, with the last intensity, a sculptor. In her excellent dissertation on Story, Jane Seidler Ramirez agrees that despite the indispensability of Rome to the sculptor's artistic and literary production, the city proved injurious to Story. And she finds useful the analogy that James employed to characterize Story's position in Rome. There, James wrote, Story was like, quote, a merman, exploring waters too deep and dangerous for his abilities, unquote. In James's eyes, Rome set Story adrift rather than providing him with a haven. In the end, Rome's many attractions turned out to be too many attractions for Story, causing him to divide his occupations and master none. When he, Hawthorne, and James were all young and all new to Rome, however, they all three relished its bounties, among them the freedom and the circumstances to study the male body in sculpture. All three responded to the viewing sanctuary Rome provided with images of androgynous masculinity. Their tentativeness, if that's what it is, has, to my mind, everything to do with the artistic environment of the city, and not as much to do with the nude youth as an object of desire and same-sex captivation, and even less to do with the failure of nerve. That Rome was the place where American male body considerations in sculpture found its beginning in the contemplation of the sculptured nude youth seems very much their success. But aside from the question of framing male viewing of the male body in art, there may be something else to think about finally in regard to the Hawthorne-James Story triangle. Hawthorne sends Kenyon back to the States because, the narrator declares, the years have a kind of emptiness when we spend too many of them on a foreign shore. But in so doing, Hawthorne makes it clear that his sculptor has not achieved artistic proficiency in Rome, and we hold few expectations for his future. Roderick Hudson dies, proving his mother's admonition that, quote, Rome is an evil word, unquote, but not before he realizes that Rome made him feel and understand more things than he could express, unquote. What I'm getting at here is that for Kenyon and for Roderick, as for Story, it turned out that it took more than being in Rome to be a sculptor, which might be another level of truth about artistic havens. Thank you.
When Claude Monet brought his extended stepfamily to Giverny in 1883, it was a small village of farmers located on the Seine River Valley, 40 miles northwest of Paris. Its stone houses, mills, church, and town hall were not extraordinary, but its lush fields and tree-lined River Ept offered picturesque views. Monet could perhaps foresee a variety of outdoor subjects in the rural setting, but he could certainly not predict the arrival of hundreds of young artists who soon laid claim to this village. Perhaps no one could imagine it. In 1887, only 7 or 8 artists worked in the village. 3 years later, there were over 50. The vast majority of the 350 known artists to have worked in Giverny between 1885 and 1915, the vast majority were American, but others we know came from Argentina, Australia, Canada, Great Britain, Poland, Norway, Sweden. The presence of Monet attracted them, but it alone did not suffice to make Giverny such a popular destination. In many ways, Monet was both present and absent. While several foreigners consciously attempted to emulate his art, most came to Giverny independently of him and contributed to a vibrant social and artistic life that developed without him. The desire to work and live within a community of international artists in a rural setting is a common phenomenon of artist colonies, artist havens, already popular throughout Europe by this time. That such colonies led to the development of a common aesthetic and that sight and style could become intricately linked were concepts that artists understood even as they participated in them. I was supposed to show this earlier, but the photographs I'm going to show you are period photographs that are owned by descendants of the Bodi family. The Hotel Bodi is very well known in Giverny, and then this is another postcard of Giverny. And the photograph of Monet is by Theodore Robinson, an American artist. In 1892, writing from Paris, American artist Philip Leslie Hale, who you see on the left, and a painting by him from Giverny on the right, described how a well-loved site could encourage a single artistic style to develop. Hale wrote, quote, "The same men, by going year after year to the same place, acquire a style, a way for each town is apt to have its dominant spirit, either master or advanced pupil, whom the others, consciously or not, imitate." Hale, who spent several summers in Giverny between 1887 and 1892 and returned with his wife in 1904, implied that repeat visits to the village would teach an artist the Giverny trick and thus initiate him into a common group and differentiate him from a Sunday painter or tourist. Hale suggested that artists who became faithful to Giverny would be willing, at least temporarily, to abandon some of their own methods and techniques and to adopt the colors, subjects, and brushstrokes of artists already in the village. And yet to acknowledge a trick or a trademark to paintings produced in Giverny is to point out a predetermined experience of the village and to suggest that artists arriving as early as 1892, just 5 years after the first group of American artists had come to the village, could not escape imitation and assimilation of a certain pre-established style. Indeed, the term trick, which means expertise or know-how, also suggests deceit or illusion. Today I want to discuss 2 ideas inspired by Hale's essay about the Giverny trick. The first is the notion of a common aesthetic associated with the village around 1892, and the second concerns the initiation of artists faithful to the village into this aesthetic as a way to distinguish themselves. In other words, I want to ask, and maybe not answer, what the Giverny trick might be, and also why artists would want so much to learn it. The first foreign artists to paint actively in Giverny in 1887 treated the same subjects in similar ways. Numerous pictures depict trees along a river, the Ept, or perhaps its small tributary, the Rue, which runs right along the bottom of Giverny. Louis Ritter on the left and William Blair Bruce on the right captured the slow-flowing river and shade-filled banks. They painted colored reflections on the water, cows in the background. John Leslie Breck on the left added a bridge, and you can barely see far in the background. Hale, his own version on the lower right, a peasant woman in the foreground. Theodore Wendell on the left and Willard Metcalf on the right painted off-center compositions and treated the grassy banks with the same shades of bright green. All 6 of these pictures share a similar painting touch, based on a Barbizon-inspired form of realism and the beginnings, for Bruce, Wendell, and Metcalf at least, of a more impressionistic brushstroke. They also share a similar palette. A soft lime green can be found in most of the pictures, and several of these artists employed dark green or violet for the shadows in the water or on the ground. These early paintings may not yet be evidence of a common trick, but perhaps they lay the groundwork for one. Artists and journalists often described color as a key characteristic of pictures produced in Giverny, noting especially the prevalence of purple and a certain shade of green. Visiting Giverny in 1891 for an extended stay, James Carroll Beckwith, whose portrait of fellow artist John Leslie Breck from Giverny is pictured here. James Carroll Beckwith wrote in his diary about his progress and frustrations while living in Giverny. Quote, "I am trying to get hold of handling foliage out of doors, but the values trouble me. They have a way here of using blues and lilacs, which is very effective." End quote. Artists working in Giverny before him had employed certain colors as a shortcut, perhaps, to capture visual effects particular to this region, and he seems to want to make use of it. 1889, a critic in the United States noted that Wendell's pictures, and there's another example of a Wendell picture in the upper left, from the village, stood somewhere between the plein airists, quote, whose spectacles are tinted cabbage green, and the impressionists who, quote, see everything as purple and violet. If just a few years later, a journalist for the New York Times spoke of artists who had made a pilgrimage to Giverny and returned with pictures filled with violet and pink. And commenting on his first encounter with the Giverny pictures by Breck, and you have an example of another work by Breck on the lower right, Hamlin Garland recalled a flare of primitive colors and blue and purple shadows. We can find these brighter colors and purple shadows in other pictures from the early 1890s produced in Giverny, such as Theodore Robinson in the Orchard on the left, and Louis Paul Dessart, Peasant Woman in Haystacks on the right. Another favorite motif associated with the village may help explain another possible aspect of the Giverny trick. In May 1891, Monet exhibited 15 of his famous grain stacks painted in Giverny since 1890. Working throughout the winter months, Monet had studied the changing effects of atmosphere, light, and shadow on a single motif. These pictures sold quickly and attracted a great deal of attention in the art world and in Giverny. That summer, Breck painted 15 of his own grain stacks over a period of 3 days, concentrating on the changing shadows and colors at different times of day. There are 12 of these sketches that remain, and I'm going to just show them quickly, but it's upper left to upper right, bottom left to bottom right. And they are numbered, so it is the different moments of the day. Like Monet, Breck concentrated more on shadows, color, and texture than on the motif, deflecting perhaps the social significance from the grain to the light and repetitive shapes. But whereas Monet sought to capture the envelope of atmosphere surrounding his grain stacks, working from different points of view in different seasons on different sized canvases, Breck wanted to work through Monet in his series in a very short period of time. The exact placement of the grain stacks in each work is the same, for example, something that Breck transferred from one identically sized canvas to the next. He seemed almost to have set his watch by the changing sun, recording a single day over a period of 3 days, instead of a wide variety of atmospheric characteristics over a period of months. Such formulaic shortcuts prevent these sketches from transcending just what they are, school-like exercises, kind of a trick. And yet, the instant popularity of Monet's grain stacks had led artists to wonder if he himself were not resorting to some sort of trickery, if perhaps, as Pissarro had complained, Monet was repeating himself in order to sell, then the grain stacks were somehow simply copies produced to please his audience. Now, of course, they weren't, but Monet's multiple views of grain stacks led to an assimilation of that symbol, that motif, and they became associated with Giverny for years to come. Artists painted grain stacks in Giverny as late as 1910, 1915. The possibility that artists produced similar subjects, used similar palettes, and experimented with Impressionism at the same time, though admittedly in different ways, may indeed point to a common way of painting. But the trick practiced in Giverny may be less specific than repetitive grain stacks or the use of green. It may refer to the passage from naturalism to Impressionism, the process of this learning being something that the artists are experimenting with. Excuse me. Or it may refer to a collective engagement with current ideas about painting. As vague as that sounds, Beckwith himself wrote, quote, "There are new ideas here, which are very valuable, if only I could apply them." He expressed what Hale described in his article, that artists who spent time in Giverny would learn a certain aesthetic, or even perhaps a certain approach to painting from what mediated through what had already been produced there. But the strength of a common way to paint, or way to think about painting, lies not only in its promise of apprenticeship, but also, I suggest, in its promise of initiation. And again, these photographs from the family. Though Hale did not address tourism in his short text, the idea that repeat visitors learn the Giverny trick suggests that one-time visitors did not. In 1892, facing a particular soar in its popularity, Giverny was on its way to becoming a comfortable, stereotypical colony overrun with artists. It attracted mostly Anglo-Saxon visitors, and its social hub was a hotel where artists could speak English, purchase painting supplies, and even, we're told, eat Boston baked beans. For these reasons, Giverny provided a safe place for visiting artists. It offered the illusion of immersion into French rural life without the hassles of actually living in an ordinary French village all alone. Many artists acknowledged this almost nostalgic vision of the French countryside, commenting on the charm of the scenery, the quaint aspects of the village. Will Lowe compared the dining room of the Hotel Bodie in 1892 to a transplanted American seaside or mountain summer resort, and noted more than 30 artists, mostly women, eating together in the dining room. He also commented, and this is interesting for what I'm trying to say, he also commented on the fact that Theodore Robinson, one of Giverny's pioneers, distanced himself from this crowded dining room and preferred to take his meals at the cafe surrounded by villagers. In this aspect, Giverny resembled other artist colonies, whereas Nina Lubrin has demonstrated in her book, Rural Artist Colonies in Europe, artists differentiated themselves from tourists or Sunday painters by claiming a more genuine encounter with the chosen site or more familiarity with the village. Serious artists wanted to see and to be seen as a native, or at least as a long-term resident, even if they were still in some ways still tourists themselves. Initiated artists benefited from the comfort that came with the village and, with rare exceptions, never truly became villagers. In the 1890s and beyond, as Giverny became more and more crowded with artists, the repeat visitors found ways to emphasize their initiation into the village and therefore their difference from all those other artists. Merrick MacMonnies wrote that Madame Claude Monet came to call on her when, quote, "it became apparent that we were now definitely residents and not mere summer people," end quote. And Will Lowe could describe the high stone walls around the MacMonnies property where he was living for a season as keeping the, quote, "vulgar out," referring not, I believe, to the peasants in the village, but to the masses of students gathering at the hotel. And for those new arrivals, the quickest way to acquire the status of a serious artist or to be one of the core group was to paint one of the symbolic motifs, a grain stack perhaps, or to master this strange Giverny trick. Artists who chose to come to Giverny in 1892 knew what to expect from the village, what scenes they might paint, and apparently how they would paint them. This knowledge involves a contradiction, of course, one that is perhaps inherent in the experience of artists in the village from the 1890s onward, because in seeking genuine encounters with nature or authentic experiences of French rural life, artists confronted a pre-existent formula for living and painting there, to show that they too could claim genuine, superior encounters with Giverny than their fellow students freshly arrived from Paris or elsewhere. They had to imitate those artists who had already encountered it and sacrifice all claims of originality. This illusion of authenticity continues today. In closing, I evoke today's Giverny and its 400,000 annual visitors who seek the same authentic experiences sought by these artists a century earlier. Sunny weekends in April and May become so crowded that tourists wait hours for the chance to enter Monet's gardens, only to contend with crowds, cameras, and noise. And relatively few tourists venture into the village itself, past the Hotel Bodie and as far as the church, all of them seeking some kind of genuine experience. They enjoy the comfort offered by modern conveniences, even as they seek the picturesque remnants of past centuries. This search for authenticity is part of the modern experience. As Dean McConnell wrote in his important book from 1976, The Tourist, modern people, he explained, seek reality and authenticity in other periods and cultures. And this search is rooted in nostalgia, which itself played a defining role in the development of artist colonies. Lebrun called them geographies of nostalgia. The mass tourism of a small French village like Giverny is by definition fueled by nostalgia and a search for authenticity. Both then and now, that search is thwarted by the village's own popularity and stereotypes. And I'm grateful to my colleague, Verla Tillmans, for this fabulous image from The New Yorker. Both then and now, the village is mediated by and through other visitors. It is beholden to its stereotypes. It is an illusion or a trick that changes according to one's expectations. Thank you.
The subject of my talk today is AfriCOBRA. In 1962, Jeff Donaldson, a young African-American artist living in Chicago, asked fellow painter Wadsworth Gerald what proved a prophetic question. Would it be possible, Donaldson inquired, to start a Negro art movement based on a common aesthetic creed? 7 years later, in 1969, the question led to the formation of one of America's most revolutionary art groups, one that continues to operate today, making it perhaps America's longest running. In 1969, AfriCOBRA, or the African Commune of Bad Relevant Artists, was founded by Donaldson, Gerald, and others to explore the principles of what by the late 1960s was their interest in a global black aesthetic. AfriCOBRA emerged in the critical moment when advocates of black power and black liberation called on people to go, as Asafa Jalada suggests, beyond the civil rights demand and developed their own cultural and economic institutions. Artists in AfriCOBRA established a specific mission to create positive expressions of the beauty of black American experiences using imagery of a global black diaspora. Many traveled to Africa to absorb what Donaldson termed a trans-African synthesis of imagery and ideas. Others studied art from Africa and addressed metaphorical constructions of their identities as black people. For AfriCOBRA, Africa and the global black diaspora were both geographical havens abroad and shared ancestral memories, visual wells from which to draw new expressions of the beauty and continuity of black and black American experiences. Many of the artists who founded AfriCOBRA met in Chicago in the mid-1960s under the auspices of the Organization of Black American Culture, or OBAC, founded by Hoyt Fuller, editor of the publication Black World, and a prominent figure in America's black arts movement. Pronounced Obasi, meaning chieftain in the Yoruba language, the organization sponsored a visual arts workshop that led to the creation of the Wall of Respect, a mural painted on a brick building on 43rd Street and Langley on Chicago's South Side. Painted in 1967, the Wall of Respect incorporated portraits of a range of black American heroes, including Martin Luther King Jr., Nat Turner, Malcolm X, Muhammad Ali, Gwendolyn Brooks, Aretha Franklin, and Harriet Tubman. Photographs of contemporary figures were added to the mural and poems inscribed upon it over the course of its 3-year existence. The mural was destroyed in a mysterious fire in 1970. 4 artists who contributed portraits to the Wall of Respect, Jeff Donaldson, Barbara Jones Hogu, Wadsworth Gerald, and Carolyn Lawrence, founded COBRA, or the Coalition of Black Revolutionary Artists, in 1968. COBRA, the predecessor to AfriCOBRA, continued the Wall of Respect's mission to celebrate black American heroism. However, COBRA also wanted to express the beauty of ordinary black life, a critical uphill battle in America in the 1960s. In 1965, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, one of Lyndon Johnson's theoreticians of the war on poverty, had asserted that, quote, black culture was a product of a social pathology whose source was the unstable black family, end quote. Moynihan's report reinforced a national legacy of racist ideas and images of black life in America. Following an approach that AfriCOBRA continues to employ, COBRA artists selected a single theme, in this case that of the black family, and created works to address the subject. Wadsworth Gerald's resulting black family is a visual corrective to Moynihan's depiction. The painting is a portrait that emphasizes strength and unity. Black family also employs a set of specific aesthetic principles developed by COBRA to render positive images of black people. The aesthetics express an antidote to negative stereotypes and were codified collectively and described in COBRA's mission statement. These principles include requirements that the visual statement must be humanistic, with the figure frontal and direct to stress strength. The subject matter must be completely understood to the viewer, therefore requiring lettering to clarify the visual statement. The visual statement must identify our problems and offer a solution, a pattern of behavior or attitude. The visual statement must educate, it must speak of our past, present, or future, and make black, positive, direct statements created in bright, vivid, singing Kool-Aid colors of orange, strawberry, cherry, lemon, lime, grape. In black family, the dignified frontal family group sits against a background composed of the letter B, signifying blackness, beauty, black prince, a reference to Malcolm X, in absentia spiritual father. The bright Kool-Aid colors, named for the popular drink, reflect the playful colors of contemporary American advertising, clothing, and style, giving the work an upbeat, popularly accessible character. Yet, as COBRA artist Barbara Jones Hogu explained, the art was, quote, not fantasy or art for art's sake. It was specific and functional by expressing statements about our existence as black people, end quote. By the end of 1969, COBRA realized that the subjects that interested them the most were connected to a larger black diaspora. Gerald's black family was not only a statement concerning black American life, but black life in a universal context. In 1969, COBRA became AfriCOBRA, the African commune of bad, relevant artists. Gerald's portraits of Malcolm X and Angela Davis inscribe the heroic power of two figures who positioned the struggles of black America as part of a larger black liberation connected with all people of African descent. Both portraits emphasize rhetorical power and offer an educative statement of the ideas associated with the speakers, thus emphasizing AfriCOBRA's functional agenda. Malcolm X, who made a critical pilgrimage to Africa before his death, asserted that, quote, all black people, regardless of their land base, have the same problems, the control of their land and economics by Europeans or Euro-Americans, end quote. The text of his famous statement, by all means necessary, swirls across his chest. In Gerald's portrait, the grand scale of Malcolm X's face and fist reiterate his fearless character, even in martyrdom. Angela Davis, a member of the Black Panthers, called for black women to join in the struggle for black self-determination at home and abroad. In Gerald's portrait Revolutionary, Davis's body is composed of words, including the text of her famous statement, I have given my life to the struggle. The real cartridge belt attached to the canvas symbolizes the potential for violence from all sides in the process of revolution. AfriCOBRA did not shy from bringing forth aggressive visual elements for an agenda for Black self-determination. Yet they did so by way of popular visual connections. In 1970, J. Gerald, a member of AfriCOBRA and textile artist who currently operates a design store in Tribeca, designed a revolutionary suit for Angela Davis with a belt and bullet trim. J. Gerald's design, which she models in this photograph, emphasizes pride and power, the miniskirt from one point of view, liberation of the female body from the constraints of all-inclusive coverings, and also trendy. Revolutionary suit combines contemporary fashion with a political message, an important element of AfriCOBRA's mission to make social issues relevant in day-to-day life, to model a pattern of behavior or attitude, and to do so through art. As AfriCOBRA explored its philosophical commitment to global Black culture, the group incorporated new aesthetic strategies, including shine, abstraction, and free symmetry, qualities AfriCOBRA associated with African arts ranging from music to sculpture. Music is the symbolically charged element that centers the composition in Donaldson's Message from Tahuti and allows Donaldson to explore formal abstraction, visual syncopation, and symmetry. In the painting, Papa Joe Jones, a famous Black American musician, appears as a faint ghost-like outline, playing drums amidst symbols of Amenta, the Egyptian netherworld. Unfortunately, Papa Joe Jones may not be visible in this particular slide. Images of the ibis, an attribute of the Egyptian god Tahuti, and ankhs, Egyptian symbols of life, surround the drums. Donaldson explained that as an art form, music served as a means for Black resistance. American slave owners often encouraged music and dance among slaves, not realizing their potential for expressing rebellion. With its dazzling, jazz-like abstract rhythms, Message from Tahuti celebrates the positive, universal experience of Black music as well as its liberating potentials. AfriCOBRA artists studied art from Africa, traveled to Africa, and many remain important scholars of African and African American art and art history today. As a graduate student at Howard University, Wadsworth Gerald studied the art of the baule of the Côte d'Ivoire. His Navaga is a depiction of the Navaga or baule woodcarver. The Navaga is rendered with AfriCOBRA's signature syncopated high-intensity color. The face of the Navaga is taken from a photograph of Gerald's own father, abstracted in baule style. The strategy synthesizes Gerald's family history with the larger global history of African people, and Gerald with the African artist, here the baule Navaga. In 1977, members of AfriCOBRA also participated in a worldwide celebration of Black arts in Lagos, Nigeria, Festac 77, the second World Black and African Festival of Arts and Culture. Over 15,000 artists from countries around the world participated in the festival, which took place from January 15th to February 12, 1977. Events included art exhibitions, dance performances, musical performances, colloquia, and workshops. Jeff Donaldson led the delegation of artists from North America, and J. Gerald chaired the Festac Committee of Creative Modern Black and African Dress. The aims of Festac mirrored those of AfriCOBRA, among them to present Black and African culture in its highest and widest conception. At Festac 77, AfriCOBRA artists exhibited their work in the National Theatre Gallery and pursued side trips to other parts of West Africa. For many, the trip was pivotal in their understanding of themselves as what Moyo Okadiji terms returnee artists. Okadiji defines the returnee artist in an essay written for Transatlantic Dialogues, a catalog written by AfriCOBRA artist and art historian Michael Harris. Okadiji's returnee artist is one who has, in his words, personally experienced the warmth and the cold, sniffed the earth, and felt the textures of the old continent, end quote. After Festac, AfriCOBRA composed a group series on the struggles of Black people living under apartheid in South Africa. Apartheid for AfriCOBRA represented a universal oppression of Black people with associations with Black American slavery. On June 16, 1976, Soweto, a segregated Black district in South Africa, was the scene of a brutal massacre of more than 500 African students by South African police. The students were protesting the government's mandate that classes be taught in the Afrikaans language rather than in English. In his drawing Soweto, part of his Soweto series, artist Nelson Stevens chooses to depict an act of humanity in the face of the terror and tragedy of Soweto. Two students carry an injured or killed classmate while they all stand in the line of fire. Despite the onslaught, the figures remain active and strong, unified in their collaborative effort to resist. Stevens' drawing epitomizes AfriCOBRA's visual imperative for community resistance to actions intended to dehumanize Black people. The image also reflects AfriCOBRA's mission to educate about the conditions of Black people across the globe. As the 1980s approached, AfriCOBRA remained a vital group in which, as AfriCOBRA artist Edgar Cowers suggested, artists worked with shared aesthetic ideals in their own individual styles, much like jazz musicians. Imagery of Africa continued to influence their work, which ranged from abstract to representational. AfriCOBRA artist James Phillips' Water Spirits exudes a spiritual, meditative quality by way of figures such as a snake linked to the Nomo water spirits of West African Dogon art and myth. The striking zigzag patterns in the painting recall Central African, Congo Kingdom, and Cuba textile design and body arts. Phillips' synthesis of symbolism from different Black cultures in a contemporary image also challenges a linear sense of history. The painting's symbolism merges past, present, and future. In this context, Phillips' rendering is consistent with postmodern ideas of the multi-layered nature of time and experience. In Queen Candace, AfriCOBRA artist Murray DePillars takes a similar approach to what AfriCOBRA termed inheritable art forms from Africa. In the painting, DePillars depicts the Ethiopian Queen Candace, believed in legend to have successfully defeated the Roman armies under Alexander. The moment of her historical importance is omitted, and she is instead isolated as a timeless icon of female beauty. In Queen Candace, DePillars combines African design elements, including bead-like patterns, textile-inspired surfaces, with popular Kool-Aid colors. The resulting Queen Candace is a study of a Black woman that Richard J. Powell suggests proclaims royalty, power, and omnipotence. However, Queen Candace is also a portrait of an ordinary woman. Angela Davis spoke of the need for women in the Black Revolution to be more than, as she put it, baby makers. In Queen Candace, DePillars offers a mother and a political figure and a woman depicted on her own. That her portrait is as much a part of AfriCOBRA as J. Gerald's revolutionary suit, suggests AfriCOBRA's determination to provide art that above all promotes pride in Black identity, a critical element in AfriCOBRA's agenda from the beginning. The point of access into the work may vary by viewer and by artist, yet conveys what were intended to be identity-empowering effects. From the late 1960s through the present, AfriCOBRA has forged a body of imagery of Black experiences marked by unparalleled optimism and commitment to an African-inspired global Black aesthetic. Their efforts to create a space in which Black art may be different, joyous, and positive at the same time are revolutionary acts in and of themselves. This talk has been a brief introduction to a group of artists who merit further study. Since 1969, the number of artists in AfriCOBRA has grown to over 20. As AfriCOBRA continues working, its artistic visions remain relevant. Created in 2002, AfriCOBRA artist Achille Ron Anderson's stained glass installation for the Washington, D.C. Metro line reflects AfriCOBRA's continued presence. Anderson's panels depict an abstraction of the Sankofa bird of traditional West African Asante art. The Sankofa bird is associated with the importance of returning to one's roots to move forward. Like Sankofa, the art of AfriCOBRA moves forward while remaining rooted in the cultural and visual contexts of Africa and the Black diaspora. Thank you very much.
Go ahead, over here, please.
Hi. Is it on? Can everyone hear me? Hi, I'm Laura Katzman. I have a question for Katherine about the Giverny topic. You mentioned that the artists that went to Giverny sought authenticity, and it sounded like they sought authenticity of place and space. But what about authenticity of art? I mean, were any of them troubled by issues of authenticity in their own painting, originality, copying, and the pressure around creating something original in a place that was so fraught with Monet's
It's an
influence?
excellent question, and I don't know if I can answer in terms of a lot of different artists, but in Hale's essay that I quoted from, he goes on to talk about how imitation is a necessary phase of an artist's development. So I think he would feel, and many of these artists would feel, that it was all right to imitate or assimilate or work through these sort of stereotypes that were starting to exist, because that was still part of learning, and that then to reject them or to move beyond them would happen after you had been in Giverny for a while or after you've left. I know other scholars have worked on Theodore Robinson in particular, and his relationship with Monet, trying hard to learn from Monet, but to develop something that he could claim to be particularly his own, and in his case, something particularly American. And he worked through that then when he returned to the United States. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, it does in part. I couldn't help but think of the way in which American Impressionists have been denigrated for so long because of the derivative nature of their work, and
Yes.
that's why I wondered if they themselves were troubled by that.
There, I think, is certainly some of it. Hale's own letters, early on, he mentioned something, maybe as a reassurance to his parents, but as he's writing home to his mother saying, my work is not impressionistic, my work is not, and yet he realizes that he too is sort of, falling into this. So I don't know if it's something, I guess I'll have to think more about your question. I don't know if it's something that all the artists were aware of, but I think it is something that some of them confronted face on and had to deal with.
Thank you, and I think we have a question over here.
Yes, hi. I'm Susan Platt. I wanted to thank all of you for your fascinating papers. I was particularly struck with the AfriCOBRA paper. I've always wanted to know more about that group. All I've ever seen is one brochure from a show at Cornell, which I've held closely to my heart for years. So thank you very much, and I hope you'll publish a whole book on the subject. I was particularly fascinated with your interpretation of the sources of the abstract patterns. And of course, that is the period of time in American mainstream art when we had the pattern and decorative movement peaking. So I wanted to know relationships, or if this, or in fact the mainstream took from the AfriCOBRA ideas. I mean, I'm wondering about that relationship. Thank you.
That's a great question. I want to say that it was taken from AfriCOBRA. I think, although I think it's probably impossible to determine which came first, I think the pattern and decorative movement, as well as poster art, and some of the what we would now call graphic arts, were already in place for AfriCOBRA far before they became popular. In one way, which I didn't mention, when AfriCOBRA first started, they could make inexpensive prints that just looked really good because of the patterning, etc. And this allowed their art to be purchased by more people. But they're definitely, they're studying art history, they're artists who are looking at other artists, they're absolutely connected with the other movements going on, and still are.
Can I just comment on that real quickly? I also think that there's an interesting connection because there's this access to textiles, African textiles in particular, to kente cloth, right? And we have, so the idea of pattern and decoration of the various forms, and kente in particular, becomes at that moment, and we see a trajectory now where it shows up on everything from umbrellas, et cetera, but to postcards and T-shirts and coffee mugs, but that kente and the famous dashike becomes adopted as kind of a cultural, very direct connection to a celebration of African textiles as well. So is there someone on this side? Hi.
Hi, I'm John Bowles, and one thing that I found really interesting about all three of your papers is that you gave examples of artists who imagine themselves working within what we might today consider a global context. But at the same time, they were really viewing the globe from an American context. And I was interested to know whether any of you have thought about what that might reveal about America's place at the particular historical moment you're looking at.
I'd like to start, but Katie and I were just exactly having that conversation before the program began. One of the things that I always thought was so interesting about the Americans in Italy is, I think except for Bourguignon, none of them spoke Italian. Powers was there for several decades, and he never had a conversation with an Italian person, nor did his family. And Hawthorne says in his journals that he knows a few words to, I'm sorry, the lights are in my eyes. I must be always at the wrong size. And I'm getting terribly distracted. And Hawthorne says in his journals, well, he has enough to say something to, I don't know, tell the carriage driver where to go. But aside from that, they were all waiting for the Italians to speak English to them. And that's a kind of interesting idea. So it became, it really was an artist haven. It was also a little artist island in which they all lived. And then Katie and I were just discussing how that might still be the case. I don't mean this in any I don't mean this in any derogatory way at all, but I noticed yesterday, and I've actually forgotten who asked for translations of books published about American art abroad. How about Americans learning to read the language in which this might be done? That's just one of the ways we were talking. You go ahead. We had some more thoughts about that.
Yeah, no, I agree that especially the Giverny moment, there were a lot of artists, the early pioneers, that we call them pioneers, the first artists who came, many of them did speak French. They were looking to avoid Barbizon, which by then had become this overrun colony. So they were thrilled to be in Giverny. And there's a lot of those stories about, well, they didn't know Monet lived down the street, and whether, we know some of them certainly did. But there is still more of a hope, maybe, to see the landscape paint and work within a context where their Americanness wouldn't matter, that they wouldn't have to make the claim to it. However, Giverny develops very quickly and then becomes very Anglo-Saxon and largely American community. So I think you're right that seeing it through American eyes, and my quick closing there, but it's still very interesting to notice that today, although the Musée Américain has a different public than the Monet Gardens, that many of those English-speaking American tourists are waiting for the French to speak English to them, and of course many of the French do speak English to them now. So it's an interesting question, and we're not quite ready maybe to move beyond that.
I just think of one example of an AfriCOBRA artist, Michael Harris, who has studied the Yoruba language, I believe, and is fluent in that language, and I believe did that to sort of respond to the question you were asking about, to get more of what we would call an insider's, thick, descriptive view.
Thank you. Do we have? Hi.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Hutchinson, and to maybe follow up on that last question with something that interests me. Thanks for 3 wonderful papers. This is about Kirstin's. One of the things that I think is so interesting about the period that you study is the way in which African artists and African culture in general is looking to America to invent a modern sense of their own cultural identity at this period. So music and arts, such as the AfriCOBRA artists who go there, actually, at least I've heard a little bit about this, are actually being influenced by this American celebration of Africa in some interesting ways that cycle around. But my question for you is, and I'm wondering if you might be able to relate the notion of a global diaspora or the importance of a diasporic cultural unity in the period that you study to the earlier articulation of a need for such a sense of identity in Negritude and the Harlem Renaissance period.
You make me think of someone like John Biggers immediately, even as I was thinking what you're going to ask, and other artists who were traveling to Africa. I think, as Renée pointed out when speaking about kente cloth, the AfriCOBRA artists were visiting newly independent African countries in a post-colonial context. And that notion of Pan-Africanism, sort of symbolized by kente cloth, added a different dimension, perhaps, to that idea of returning artist, which is this term Okadiji uses, which I think is really useful. But that's absolutely correct that they're not the first to go. AfriCOBRA also has a shared aesthetic agenda which keeps them tight, which may be something a little different in terms of a group going, artists returning, Festac, just the timeliness of Festac, for example.
And can I just say, Can I just respond a little bit? Because I think it's interesting that the New Negro text of the Harlem Renaissance becomes a text read by the developers of the Negritude movement. So there's a direct connection between the two. But that this idea, it's really myth-making of Africa as place, as homeland that happens with the Harlem Renaissance. I mean, none of these people have gone there. Their encounter of African objects is through European exhibitions and American exhibitions. So their notions of Africa, particularly I think for the Harlem Renaissance artists, is rather limited, and it's limited to a few objects that have come into America. But there is this way in which Alain Locke's text lives on that I find really fascinating, that there's people in kind of the post-colonial moment in the 60s and 70s who are talking about that book, and as it being a really, for them, one could say seismic in the way that it lays out Black identity. But it's Du Bois who in fact talks in the last chapter of that book about a global Africa, about a larger diaspora, and that it is through kind of a uniting, I mean, he uses the term Pan-Africanism, but he's really talking about a diaspora at the end of that, of the New Negro, and arguing for this idea that there's connections. But it's a mythic place. I think that's really important, even for people who are traveling in the 60s and 70s and borrowing forms. It's part of it, it's about myth-making as well, Africa as home, and I think that's an important component. But Keith has a question.
I'm sorry, I don't have a,
Okay.
I don't have a question.
You can stand up and ask your question. Is that
Who's on first?
Sorry.
I don't have a question. I thought I may add something to the comments about AfriCOBRA and pattern painting. Nelson Stevens, one of the AfriCOBRA artists addressing a group of art historians, perhaps not too much unlike this, 30 years ago, very defensively in his intimidation, said, you know, one day pattern painting on velvet with beads is going to be worth a lot of money. And everybody laughed. And Julian Schnabel came along 10 years later and did make it worth a lot of money. But I should add, though, you know, really, AfriCOBRA did not work in a vacuum. They worked along with, like any other dynamic group of artists, with other African-American artists, and there was a lot of controversy. But their issues about pattern painting, to add to the point, did not develop unilaterally by them. African-American artists have been dealing with pattern as an issue in painting for a long time. And if you look back in Art News in the 50s, you'll find several articles by Spiral, a group in New York, Merton Simpson, Norman Lewis, Reginald Gammon, Richard Mayhew, wrote about issues of Spiral as a counterpoint to Joseph Albers' Square. So the notion, and they did 2 or 3 articles, they had a movement called Spiral. So the idea has been around for a long time, and AfriCOBRA took it in their own way and did something very wonderful with it. But you should recognize that it's not simply an arbitrary and unique, it's unique, but certainly not an arbitrary experience. Thank you.
So we're out of time. I've been told to cut it off here. So Amelia's going to come up. She has a few announcements, so if you could just hold on for one moment while she makes those. Okay, thank you very much. It's a really wonderful panel.